200 million miles away, a constant fire burns. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. A sphere of plasma over a million times larger than Earth, fusing hydrogen into helium every second for billions of years. We call it the sun. And for most of human history, that's all it's been: a light in the sky, a clock, a source of warmth, a thing we orbit and depend on, but not something we question, because as far as we understand it, we already know what it is: a star, a natural object formed from collapsing gas held together by gravity, powered by nuclear fusion. Case closed, right? But there's a subtle assumption hidden inside that explanation, one we almost never notice. We say the sun gives life. It powers photosynthesis, it drives weather, it stabilizes the conditions that allow biology to exist. It's the reason anything grows, moves, or survives here at all. But giving life is not the same thing as designing the conditions for it. Because when you zoom out, the sun doesn't just sit there shining. It holds 99.8% of the entire solar system's mass. It dictates the motion of every planet. It shaped the early environment those planets formed in. It continues to regulate the energy flow of the entire system, even now. In other words, it didn't just light the stage, it built it. And that raises a strange question. If the sun created the solar system, even in the purely scientific sense, then what exactly is it really doing? Because there's another way to look at this, not as a contradiction to science, but as a different layer of interpretation. One where the sun isn't just a passive object, but part of a creative hierarchy. In the law of one, stars like our sun are described as sublogoi, not the creator with a capital C, but the source of all things. Something more than matter and less than the infinite. A localized creator operating within a larger design, which is either a profound insight or the sun just got promoted to middle management. And if that idea sounds strange, good. Because once you follow it to its conclusion, it doesn't just change what the sun is, it changes what this entire system might be. Before we move into unfamiliar territory, we need to understand something clearly. Because whatever the sun might be, this part is not up for debate. We know a lot about it. At its most basic level, the sun is a G type main sequence star, a classification scientists label as G2V. It formed approximately 4.6 billion years ago from the gravitational collapse of a region within a giant molecular cloud. A cloud made mostly of hydrogen with traces of helium and heavier elements, the leftovers of earlier stars that lived and died before ours. As that cloud collapsed, it began to spin, faster and faster, flattening into a rotating disk. At the center, pressure and temperature increased until something critical happened. Nuclear fusion ignited, and the sun was born. At its core, the temperature reaches around 15 million degrees Celsius. Under that pressure, hydrogen atoms don't behave like they do here. They fuse through what's called the proton proton chain. Four hydrogen nuclei combine, eventually forming helium, but something else happens in that process. A small amount of mass is lost, converted directly into energy as described by Einstein's equation E equals mc squared. Every second, the sun converts about 600 million tons of hydrogen into helium, and in doing so, it releases more energy in 1 second than humanity has used in its entire existence, which really puts your electricity bill into perspective. That energy doesn't escape immediately. Photons generated in the core can take thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years to reach the surface, bouncing, scattering, slowly making their way outward until finally they escape. And 8 minutes later, they reach Earth. This constant flow of energy is what drives nearly every system on this planet: weather patterns, ocean currents, photosynthesis, climate stability. Without it, Earth doesn't just become cold, it becomes lifeless. But the sun doesn't just influence life, it shaped the entire system from the beginning. As the early sun ignited, the remaining material in that rotating disk, gas, dust, ice, began to collide, stick together, form larger and larger bodies, a process known as accretion. Closer to the sun, where temperatures were higher, only metals and rocky materials could condense. This is why we have terrestrial planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars. Farther out, where it was cooler, ices could form, allowing planets to grow much larger, eventually capturing thick atmospheres of hydrogen and helium. The gas giants: Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. At the same time, the young sun was far more volatile than it is today. It emitted intense, powerful solar winds, which helped strip away lighter elements from the inner solar system, shaping the final structure we see now. Even today, the sun remains the dominant force in the system. Its gravity holds everything in orbit. Its electromagnetic activity influences planetary atmospheres. Its energy defines what is and is not possible here. So when science says the sun created the solar system, this is what it means. Not intention, not design, not consciousness, just physics, gravity, motion, energy, time. And to be clear, this model works. It predicts behavior, it explains observations, it aligns with everything we can measure. There's no need to reject it. But there is a quiet detail hidden inside of it, one that rarely gets discussed. Because even in this model, the sun didn't just appear within the system, it is the reason the system exists at all. It defines the environment, it governs the structure, it sets the boundaries of what can emerge. In other words, it doesn't just sit at the center, it determines the conditions of everything around it. Which, depending on how you look at it, starts to sound a little less like a light bulb and a little more like an architect. Because there is another framework, one that doesn't contradict this model, but reinterprets what the same process might mean. If science explains how the system is formed, the next question is, could there be a perspective that tries to describe why? Up to this point, everything we've said about the sun comes from observation, measurement, prediction, repeatable results. And within that framework, the story is complete. Gas collapses, fusion ignites, planets form, life emerges. But there's a subtle boundary built into that model, one that science doesn't cross, not because it can't, but because it doesn't try to. Science describes mechanism, it tells us how things happen, but it doesn't ask a different kind of question, whether those mechanisms themselves are the result of something deeper. Not a designer in the traditional sense, not a figure, not a being watching from somewhere else, but something more abstract, a principle of creation. In the Law of One, this principle is called the logos. The term comes from ancient philosophy. It is often translated as the word, the ordering principle, the source of structure. But in this context, it has a very specific meaning. A logos is not the creator, it is a focus of the creator, a localized expression of intelligence that shapes reality in a particular way. A way to think of it is this: if the creator is infinite, then a logos is like a lens, not separate, not independent, but a way in which the infinite becomes structured. And according to the law of one, creation doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds through layers. Galaxies are expressions of a logos, stars are expressions of sublogoi, and planetary systems emerge within those structures, which brings us back to the sun. In this framework, the sun is not the ultimate source of creation. Again, it is not the creator. It is something more specific, a sublogos, a localized creative intelligence operating within a larger system, which itself exists within a larger system, and so on. A cosmic org chart, but with slightly fewer meetings. This idea appears directly in the Law of One and is scattered throughout. Now, that statement sounds almost identical to what science says. The sun created the system, but the meaning behind it is very different. Because in this framework, creation isn't just the result of physical forces, it is the result of intelligent energy being shaped, focused, organized through these layers of logos. Not imposed from the outside, not controlled, but expressed. And this is where the idea starts to shift. Because if the sun is a sub-logos, then it doesn't just produce energy, it structures it. It defines how energy behaves within its domain. It sets the stage for how matter forms, how systems stabilize, and how evolution unfolds. Not as a conscious planner in the human sense, but not as something entirely unconscious either. Something in between, which is a very uncomfortable place for a star to be. And at this point, you don't have to accept this idea. That's not the goal. The goal is simpler: to recognize that there are frameworks that describe the same phenomena in a completely different way. Because if this perspective holds any truth at all, then the sun isn't just participating in the system, it is helping define it. And if that's the case, then we need to understand how this kind of creation would even work. Not through force, not through construction, but through something the Law of One describes as light itself. If the sun is a sublogos, not the creator but a localized expression within a larger creative hierarchy, then the question becomes, how does something like that create anything at all? Because it's not building planets the way we build machines. There are no tools, no hands, no assembly process. Instead, creation in this framework happens through something much more fundamental: light. Not just visible light, but what the Law of One describes as intelligent energy. Energy that is not random, not chaotic, but structured, responsive, organized. This idea shows up repeatedly in the material. Now, that might sound poetic, but it's not entirely disconnected from physics, because even in modern science, what we call matter is, at a deeper level, not solid at all. Atoms are mostly empty space. Particles behave like waves. Energy and mass are interchangeable. What we perceive as physical reality is already a kind of structured energy. The law of one takes that one step further. It suggests that light doesn't just exist, but that it is shaped. And that shaping happens through the logos, not by controlling every detail, but by establishing patterns, frameworks, rules for how energy organizes itself. In other words, the sun, as a sublogos, doesn't manually construct planets. It defines the conditions under which planets form. Gravity behaves the way it does because of these underlying patterns. Energy condenses into matter according to these rules. Orbital mechanics, stability, chemical interactions, all of it unfolds within a structure that the Logos has set in motion. The idea is described more directly here. The galaxy and all other things of material of which you are aware are products of individualized portions of intelligent infinity. As each exploration began, it, in turn, found its focus and became co creator. Using intelligent infinity, each portion created a universe and allowing the rhythms of free choice to flow, playing with the infinite spectrum of possibilities. Each individualized portion channeled the love light into what you might call intelligent energy, thus creating the so called natural laws of any particular universe. And importantly, this creation is not separate from the larger whole. The sun is not acting independently, it is not choosing in isolation. It is a sub-logos, operating within a greater logos, which itself exists within the creator. An hierarchy of creation, with no one at the top taking lunch breaks. So when we say the sun created the solar system, that doesn't mean that it built planets piece by piece. It means it generated a field of organized energy within which planets naturally emerged, not randomly, not chaotically, but as stable expressions of those underlying patterns. Which brings us to a subtle but important shift. Science describes a system where matter organizes itself through physical laws. The law of one describes a system where those laws themselves are the result of a deeper organizing principle, not contradicting science, but reframing it. Same equations, slightly bigger implications. And if that's true, if the sun is shaping the behavior of energy in this system, then the planets orbiting it may not just be byproducts of physics, they may be outcomes. And this is where things start to overlap, because the more closely you look at the scientific model, the more it becomes to resemble something unexpectedly structured. At this point, we have two very different descriptions of the same system, one from science, one from the law of one, and on the surface, they don't seem compatible. One describes a universe driven by forces, the other describes a universe shaped by intelligence. One is measurable, the other is interpretive. So the natural assumption is one must be right and the other must be wrong. But what if that's the wrong comparison? Because if you look closely, they're not actually describing different events. They're describing the same events from different levels. Science tells us a molecular cloud collapses, angular momentum creates a disk, gravity pulls matter inward, fusion ignites, planets form through accretion. The law of one doesn't deny any of that. In fact, it reinforces the idea that these processes are real. But it adds something else: that the laws governing those processes are not random. They are the result of a logos, a structuring principle that determines how gravity behaves, how energy converts to matter, how stable systems emerge. This idea appears in the material here. Each logos creates a system of natural laws which are the ways in which intelligent energy manifests. Each universe, in turn, individualized to a focus, becoming, in turn, co creator and allowing further diversity, thus creating further intelligent energies, regularizing or causing natural laws to appear in the vibrational patterns of what you would call a solar system. Thus, each solar system has its own, shall we say, local coordinate system of illusory natural laws. It shall be understood that any portion, no matter how small, of any density or illusory pattern contains, as in a holographic picture, the one creator which is infinity. Thus, all begins and ends in mystery. So, from this perspective, science is describing the mechanism. The law of one is proposing the source of the mechanism, not in opposition, but in layers. Think of it like this: if you study a video game, you can fully understand the physics inside of it: gravity, motion, collision, cause and effect. Everything behaves consistently, predictably. And from inside the game, those laws appear fundamental, but they're not the ultimate layer. They're the result of something deeper: the engine, the code, the underlying structure that defines how everything behaves, which, to be fair, is a lot easier to debug than the universe. In this analogy, science studies the physics inside the game. The law of one asks, what defines the rules of the game in the first place? And in this framework, the sun, as a sublogos, is not writing every line of code, but it is defining the parameters of the system running within it. Which means, when we observe the solar system forming through gravity and accretion, we may be watching something that is both a natural process and a structured outcome at the same time. Not contradictory, just layered. And if that idea holds even partially true, then the solar system isn't just a random accident of physics. It's a system that behaves with consistency because it was set up to behave that way. Not by a distant external force, but from within the system itself, through the very thing at its center, the sun, a star quietly running the rules of the game it exists inside. And if the rules of the system are structured, then what emerges within that system might not be entirely a fluke either, which leads to a much bigger implication, not about the sun, but about us. If the sun is a sublogos, and if it helps define the structure of the system, then something changes, not about the sun, but about everything that exists because of it. Because in the scientific model, life is often described as a byproduct, a fortunate accident, the result of the right distance from a star, the right chemical ingredients, the right conditions happening to align. And to be clear, that explanation works. But within the idea we've just explored, there's another possibility: that those quote unquote conditions weren't just allowed, they were made possible on purpose, not by intention in the human sense, not by planning or decision making the way we understand it, but by the structuring of the system itself. Because if the sun, as a sublogos, defines how energy behaves, how matter forms, how stability emerges, then it also defines the range of what can exist within that system. And within that range, life appears, not forced, not inserted, but arising naturally from a set of conditions that were never random to begin with. And if that's true, then consciousness is not an accident. It is not a glitch in the system, not something that just happened. It is something the system is capable of producing because the system was structured in a way that allows it. Which means you are not just here because the sun happens to shine. You are here because you exist within a system where shining leads to life, and life leads to awareness, and awareness eventually begins to ask questions about itself. Which, depending on your perspective, is either a beautiful design or the universe becoming self aware and immediately confused. But either way, the implication is the same. You are not separate from the system. You are not just observing it from the outside. You are something that emerged from within it, from the same rules, the same energy, the same structure, which means if the system is shaped, then so are you. Not controlled, not predetermined, but not entirely random either. A little less chaos, a little more pattern. And that raises a question that doesn't have an easy answer. If the system you exist in was structured in a way that allows consciousness to emerge, then what is consciousness actually for? Because once you start asking that question, the sun stops looking like just a source of energy and starts looking like something else entirely. Every day, you wake up under the same star. It rises, it sets, it marks time. You check the weather because of it. You feel its warmth without thinking about it. You watch it disappear and expect it to come back. It's familiar, predictable, almost invisible in how constant it is. And because of that, we don't really question it. We measure it, we model it, we photograph it, but we don't ask what it might be doing beyond shining. Because in our current understanding, it isn't doing anything. It's just happening. But if even part of what we've explored is true, if the sun, as a sublogos, helps define the structure of the system, then this isn't just a star you orbit. This is an environment, a system of rules, a framework of possibilities, a set of conditions carefully tuned for something to emerge within it, not by control, not by force, but by design at the level of structure. Which means when you stand in sunlight, you're not just experiencing energy, you're experiencing the output of a system that made your experience possible at all. The light that warms your skin is the same light that shaped the planet beneath your feet. which shape the conditions for life, which shape the conditions for you. And suddenly the sun feels a little less like an object and a little more like a context. Not something separate from you, but something you exist within. Something that defines the rules you've always lived by without ever noticing them. And if that's the case, then maybe the question isn't what is the sun, but what kind of system would create something that eventually looks back at it? Because once you see it that way, it's hard to go back to thinking of it as just a burning sphere in the sky. The next time you feel sunlight on your skin, pause. Not for long, just long enough to notice it. The warmth, the brightness, the fact that it traveled millions of miles just to arrive here. 8 minutes from the surface of the sun, but thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years from the moment it was created in the core. A long journey for something that feels so immediate. And yet we treat it as ordinary, background, just part of the day. But if what we've explored is even partially true, then that light is more than just energy. It is the result of a system structured in a way that allows you to exist at all, not by accident, not entirely by chance, but as part of a set of conditions that were always capable of producing this moment, this awareness, you, which is either incredibly meaningful or the universe has a very elaborate way of turning on a light bulb. Either way, the sun isn't just something you orbit. It may be something you exist within, not as a place, but as a system, a structure, a set of rules that quietly made everything you experience possible. And if that's true, then maybe the most familiar thing in your sky is also one of the least understood, not just a star, something closer to a mind. Thank you for listening or watching. I wish you all love, light, peace, and joy. Take care.